Welcome back, everyone. You all know the story of Joseph and the coat of many colors in Genesis 37. He had made his brothers angry. They deliberated some over his fate and then decided to sell him as a slave. Needing a clever excuse to explain his absence to their father, the brothers smeared some animal blood on Joseph's coat. And they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father and said, "This we have found. Please identify whether it is your son's robe or not." And he identified it and said, "It is my son's robe. A fierce animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted, and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol, to my son, mourning." Thus his father wept for him. What happens next is puzzling, because after chapter 37 comes, you guessed it, chapter 38. But why is chapter 38 there? It just seems to interrupt the narrative flow. In fact, if I were reading this out loud to you, I could skip over chapter 38, and you might not even realize it. The story flows seamlessly from chapters 37 to 39. And so for many years it was assumed that chapters like Genesis 38 were clumsy additions to the Torah, with no connection to the surrounding context. This is an utterly fallacious understanding. Chapter 38 has many connections to the book of Genesis more broadly and to its immediate context. In this video, I want to look briefly at one example of the latter, but first, we have to talk about Judah. The people in the Bible are real people, and real people make real mistakes. Judah is no exception, and his triumphs and failures both have been recorded for our instruction. So let's briefly review some of what happened in chapter 38. Two of Judah's sons had died, and he was intending to burn his daughter-in-law for sexual immorality, not knowing that he had impregnated her, thinking she was a prostitute. Now, if you're wondering how things got to that point, you're just going to have to read the chapter and find out. But you might also want to read chapter 49, where Judah gets an extraordinary blessing from his father. While some of Judah's brothers' sins are recalled by Jacob, Judah's blessing involves a scepter and the praise of his brothers. Is this the same Judah who was dipping his brother's coat in goat's blood in chapter 37? Is this the same guy who was sleeping with a prostitute who actually wasn't a prostitute in Genesis 38? What changed? That's what Genesis 38 answers. It's Judah's turning point. To see how this is the case, let's read chapters 37 and 38 intertextually. You've already seen this passage. "And they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father and said, 'This we have found. Please identify whether it is your son's robe or not.'" And of course you remember Jacob's intense grief described in the rest of this passage. And we've already briefly summarized the problems that Judah got himself into in chapter 38, so let's now hear this. About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has been immoral. Moreover, she is pregnant by immorality." And Judah said, "Bring her out and let her be burned." As she was being brought out, she sent word to her father-in-law, "By the man to whom these belong, I am pregnant." And she said, "Please identify who these are, the signet and the cord and the staff." Then Judah identified them and said, "She is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah." And he did not know her again. Judah had given his signet, cord, and staff to Tamar earlier in the passage as collateral. This is a very important detail because these things served as an ancient form of identification. Judah had forsaken his family by going down to Canaan at the beginning of the chapter, and then his heritage by handing his identification over to Tamar. She was effectively handing Judah back his identity when she returned his possessions, and says the very same phrase that we heard in the previous chapter. "Please identify whether it is your son's robe or not," is now, "Please identify who these are, the signet and the cord and the staff." The force of what she is saying is something like, "Who are you, Judah?" His response is simply stated, "She is more righteous than I." This chapter is Judah's turning point, and reading chapters 37 and 38 together help understand why. We should read this phrase, "Please identify," from Tamar's lips, as recalling the deception of Judah's father in the previous chapter. The same phrase spoken by Tamar makes him recall his prior deception, which devastated Jacob. Judah and his brothers had victimized Joseph by selling him as a slave. Judah's possessions, now handed back to him by Tamar, were proof of her victimization as well. Judah has now been vividly reminded of his deception and wickedness in more than one way. Those latent memories were brought back to the surface. No wonder Tamar's words and actions were so powerful, and that this encounter marked a turning point in Judah's life. At the end of chapter 38, Judah is no longer spiritually insensitive like he was at the beginning of the chapter. He learned from his mistakes and turned from them, as we see in subsequent chapters in Genesis. There's a lesson for everyone here, and that lesson is seen most vividly when we read Genesis 38 in its literary context, something that wasn't supposed to be possible since this chapter was a later clumsy addition to the Torah. But the significance grows as we consider the canonical context. Some of the names in this tumultuous chapter of Genesis show up in Jesus' genealogy, so my mind is drawn to contemplating the Messiah. There's no embarrassment in mentioning Tamar and Judah in Matthew's Gospel because Jesus came to save his people from their sins. That's the point. He can take a depraved person and transform them into a vessel used for his glory. He's the Savior for everyone, as his genealogy shows, from Jews to Gentiles, from kings to prostitutes. Genesis 37 helps us understand Genesis 38, and both of those help us understand Matthew's strategy at the beginning of his gospel. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time.